You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
The following story has strong sexual content and may not be suitable for pre-adult audiences. The Preschool Gate by JASPER DEWITT, performed by Otis Jiry. Part 2, Once Bitten, Twice Shy. Before I keep going with the second part of this story, there are a couple of things you need to know about what happened to me between 1991 and now. Most immediately, I should tell you that Randall and I did actually go to the police about what we saw. At the time, I wasn't sure if they took us seriously, and didn't know if they actually did anything about it. What I do know is that they actually did follow up with us, and told us that they swept that piece of land for anyone in trouble, and hadn't found anything. As I now know, this was a lie calculated to protect innocent minds of children, a lie that would have disastrous consequences, and all the more so because I believe they are ultimately unexplainable. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, something else you need to know that happened shortly after that incident was that I did see the monster's victim again, but not in person. I saw a picture of his face in the local newspaper a few weeks after the fact. I didn't realize it was him at first, though I knew I recognized the face. After I realized who it was, I was actually relieved, though. I was too young to understand why people's faces got into the newspaper, and thought if they had got one that recent, he must be all right. This will also be a point of reference later on when I tell you my story. Finally, you should know that after that trip behind the gate, I never had any further conflict with Bert or Randall or any of that gang. Bert, in fact, seemed to regard me with newfound respect, and Randall might as well have been my friend, if not for the fact that his parents pulled him out of school a few weeks after everything had happened. I never found out what happened to him, but given how he acted in those few weeks, I can guess he was either institutionalized or suspended, because he started acting out in really violent ways, and would sometimes burst into tears right in the middle of class for no reason. I don't blame him. I'm actually kind of relieved I was younger than he was when it happened, because if I'd been just a few years older, I might have known things that would have made that encounter with the monster behind the gate that much more disturbing. As it was, I had nightmares for a good solid month before the memories started to fade. But unlike Randall, who would pass out of my life for years to come after he left my school, all I can say is that what happened to me afterward makes me think that the incident behind the gate was, in a fucked up way, the best thing that happened to me as a kid. Having faced down real fear that young, suddenly nothing in the mundane grind of real life seemed to hold half as much terror. I became more outgoing, more social, more of a leader among my peers. I played 2 sports in high school, made excellent grades, was elected student body president, and even briefly dated one of the hottest girls in school. I only mention that last credential because it led to arguably the most important discovery I made about myself as a teenager. The girls just didn't interest me at all in a sexual way. Of course, this being the early 2000s, I didn't let this on to most people, and it was only when I got to college that I really let myself experiment with the concept. Suffice to say that by the time I'd graduated, I'd gotten very proficient with other men, both of my age and substantially beyond it. And after I moved to New York to start my job in management consulting, that proficiency obviously found even more ways to distribute itself. At first, I let the grinder-sponsored party run wild, but as I got older, I started looking at more long-term relationships with specific men, some of which worked out for a while and some of which barely worked at all. Eventually, I even came out to my parents after gay marriage got legalized by the Supreme Court, and they took it far better than my paranoid high school self ever would have expected. But all of that's normal for guys like me. What's not normal is how deliberately I estranged myself from my hometown. Perhaps it was my negative childhood experience, or just the remembrance of being closeted for so long there. But I didn't want to see that place again. And honestly, can you blame me? It took me until December of this past year to finally make the trek home, and that was only because my father had been diagnosed with something very serious, and I wanted to make sure I saw him in case it turned out to be, well, too serious. It didn't, and honestly, not to sound cold, but my dad's illness is a private affair and doesn't really bear on this story anymore, so I'll just leave it there. All you need to know for now is that I came back home to see him in the hospital, and that after being kicked out because it was after hours, I needed a drink more than I think I ever have in my life. And frankly, an orgasm wouldn't have hurt either. Basically, anything that would take my mind off of what I was sure would happen to my father was the order of the day. So, with some basic Yelp searching, I found the nearest gay bar, which turned out to be a cheap Hawaiian-themed affair just north of where I grew up. It was still open, so I called an Uber from the hospital and was there in just under 15 minutes. And that is where my actual story begins, because, you see, when I walked into that bar that night, I had every suspicion that the place would be empty of all but the creepiest, most desperate old men, and I'd have to pull up Grindr to find an even halfway decent alternative. But it wasn't. In fact, once I was through the door, I spotted a man who I instantly recognized and who, beyond a doubt, I knew I would be spending the night with. It was unmistakable, the same long dark hair, the same lanky, overall tall form, and even an adult version of the same sallow face were all present. Randall was sitting at the bar, his back to me. The years, I saw, had been slightly less kind to him than they had been to me. His gut sagged slightly, and an unruly beard had grown up around his face. But where the thug I remembered had a face that was permanently frozen in an expression either of sulking or sneering malevolence, this man looked heart-achingly vulnerable. His eyes were sunken with sorrow, his hands clutched his drink just a touch too hard, and his body language spoke of defeat after defeat. My heart went out to the poor man, and all at once the impish pleasure I'd taken at the thought of betting my childhood bully turned to a really genuine empathy for what Randall himself must have gone through as a gay man of roughly the same age as I was. His early identity as a bully must have bound him so inextricably to the most cruel version of masculinity that the mere thought of what he really was must have felt both impossible and horrifying to acknowledge, just as the thought of what he'd seen also became too much to bear. And I made him see it. In that moment, I felt actually guilty, and decided I wasn't going to let him spend that night without my making him happy, maybe for one of the few times in his life. I pulled out the stool next to him and sat down. "Hello, Randall," I said with a smile. Randall looked up at me from the glass of beer, his face uncomprehending. "Hello?" he said, his voice still carrying that odd rasp it had from childhood. "Do I know?" "It's me," I said playfully. "Remember? Baby Barry?" Randall blinked for a few seconds. Then his face split into a sudden, infectious, happy smile. "Baby Barry!" he gasped with a happy laugh. "Holy shit! Baby Barry! I always said you were—" He caught himself. That is, "You always said I was a fag," I finished with a chuckle. "Takes one to know one, Rand." He chuckled bashfully. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I guess it does." I squeezed his arm. "Don't worry about that. We all thought things we regret once upon a time. You're here now." He nodded. "Yeah." Not much of a talker, are you? I asked with a playful edge. Sorry. Don't be, I said, if you don't feel comfortable. My wife left me yesterday. Oh, shit. You're married? I asked. Was, he said. Don't want to admit, you know. Yeah, I said, I know. What happened? She found out. She caught me with someone in the shed out back, kicked me out afterwards. I'm sorry. I reached up and touched his shoulder gingerly. He didn't object, so I held it there. Then slowly he reached his hand up to touch mine. Don't be, he said. It's better this way. I was tired of hiding, tired of pretending. I'm glad, I said. He turned and looked up into my eyes, relief warring with the fresh wounds of his soul. I'm glad you're the one who found me, he said softly. You always were the one to save people. I leaned in. Do you want to be saved? He nodded. I kissed him. He didn't stop me. We made love in the bathroom that night. Then we drank and talked until the bar finally kicked us to the curb in the early morning hours. But we didn't leave each other. We clung together in the cold, talking, laughing, and holding each other like lovers of years. We reminisced about everything, and whatever scars were left over from our shared trauma felt washed away by the sweet feeling of his arms and the sweet pall of booze over my senses. I was so happily drunk that I barely noticed where we were walking until we stood alone in the chilly dawn outside a familiar building, the old preschool, and beyond it, the preschool gate. If I'd been less drunk and less high on Randall himself, I surely would have found that sight horrifying. I would have pulled him away. Nothing like what happened would have happened. But just like my taking the run, if we'd walked away, there'd be no story, so here's what happened. Randall turned to me as soon as he saw the place and let out a drunken laugh. He chuckled. Look where we are. I looked up at the building and gave a rueful laugh myself. Is that where? Yeah, he said. That's where the preschool gate is. He gave a look that only a drunken man can think is piercing. You ever tell anyone what we saw back there, beside the cops? I shook my head. No, it seemed somehow too private. Well, too fucked up to be believed. I'm sure the cops didn't believe it. Well, said Randall with a shrug, I guess it doesn't matter. From what I hear about that old place, whatever we saw can't possibly be there anymore. How would you know? I teased. Made anybody take the run lately? He snorted. Don't be glib. Don't you know? Oh, yeah, he went on. I guess you wouldn't. You haven't been home in what, 20 years? Well, more like 10, I said. Why? What should I know? Well, he said with an impish smile, that's where a lot of teenagers go to hook up, particularly guys like us. Well, why not? He said. It's been years since anything happened. Hell, I think the last thing that happened was us. But forget that for a second. Think about it. In a fucked up way, that place might have almost been our first date. Yeah, if you count making me nearly kill myself. I laughed. Making you nearly kill yourself? He asked with faux outrage. You're the one who demanded I go back there. I think I'm owed an apology for that. Oh, really? I arched an eyebrow at him playfully. All right. I think I see where this is going. Even in the pre-dawn light, I could see him blush. Let's fuck there, he said. For old time's sake. And as a fuck you to whatever thing we saw. It can't hurt us now. Look at us. We're fucking strong. We're proud. We don't need to be afraid of anything. Again, in any other circumstances, I'd have said no, but in that moment, I knew that to do so would destroy what fragile ounce of self-esteem I'd given him, and the alcohol was still heavy enough on my brain to make me think the idea was perfect. It was a goddamn good way to send off a traumatic memory, after all. Why not do that? Why not celebrate Randall's newfound lack of fear in the very place that taught me not to be afraid for the first time? Laughing drunkenly, we walked past the preschool and climbed over the preschool gate. The place was just as still and as quiet as I remember it as a child. That sensation that the world was holding its breath still clung tight to the area, and as Randall and I made our way deep into the woods, I remember feeling the same sense of mounting unease. But I pushed on. After all, I barely remembered what the monster I'd seen had looked like, and what little I did remember suggested that it was only the size of a full-grown man. Surely 2 such men, in the prime of their lives, would be more than a match for. We'd be ready. Let the fucker come. But first we had to come. A soft bed of leaves, some 500 feet into the forest, became the occasion for our second bout of lovemaking that night, and while the first was tender, this was wild, passionate, and defiant. We screamed our joy into that oppressive silence, daring it to stop us, daring it to try to frighten us, daring it to make us cowed little boys rather than strong and beautiful men. We dared it, and as we spent ourselves together, it answered. We had just begun bucking our pants back on when we heard the leaves crunch from a few 100 feet away. We looked over at the direction of the noise, reasoning it must have been the sound of an animal at first. But as the sound became more rhythmic and got closer, it became clear to us that this was no animal. The footfalls were too heavy and too deliberate. Someone, was coming through the woods to find us. And with that realization, fear hit me for the first time that night. No, not fear. Dread. The thing beyond the gate knew we were there, and it was coming for us. It was coming to do what it could not do all those years ago. It was coming to leave us bloody and screaming on the ice, with only the prospect of passing children for rescue. But as soon as the dread came, it passed. I grabbed Randall's hand and stared toward the approaching footfalls with angry defiance. We were not boys. This thing would not hurt us. It had not traumatized me as a child, and I would not give it the satisfaction now. I would stand and face it and end it now and forever. I steeled myself for whatever I was about to see as a dark, humanoid figure rounded the tree just in front of us. It wasn't enough. Randall and I both screamed at what we saw. A human shape just slightly taller than us stood before us, but where the thing I remembered had looked strong, albeit covered in weeping sores, this thing was frail, emaciated, and impossibly brittle. The sores nearly covered its entire body and even splotched long and angry across part of its face. A pair of wide, staring, mad eyes tracked us from within the sockets of that hideous visage, a bleeding hole perched perfectly between them. But in that moment, I barely noticed the hole. All I could see was the awful look in the thing's eyes, a baleful, gleeful look of recognition. Before we could think how to act, the thing opened its mouth, and 2 whispered words escaped that dashed my comfortable, rational vision of the world to pieces. Baby. Barry. And I understood. It had been waiting for us. Whatever it was, it had been waiting for us, specifically, to come back, to let it finish what it started. I would likely have screamed at that alone, but instead, I was too wrapped with horror at what the creature did next, before I even had time to process the weight of this terrible revelation. The wound between the thing's eyes stirred, and the wriggling, searching bodies of worms poked their way out. The worms fell from the head of the thing to the ground, and as they did so, more began poking their way out of the body, this time from the sores, until a deluge of the filthy creatures was pouring from every weeping orifice in the thing's body. It smiled at us with an insane, malevolent grin, as what little muscle and skin in its hollowed-out form flattened against its bones to release the torrents of vermin, which seemed to make up a gruesome substitute for what might have once been its muscles. More horrifying still were the worms themselves. They were not garden-variety earthworms. No. Instead, the creatures had the color of blood and the length and thickness of corded rope. As they landed on the ground, thousands of tiny orifices opened in their bodies, and we saw that nearly every inch of the slimy monstrosities were covered in tiny mouths lined with tiny, razor-sharp teeth. What they truly were, I don't know, though in my darker moments I can speculate. What I do know is that as soon as they exited their hideous host, the writhing, hissing, single-minded mass began to slither toward us at a frightening speed, their infinite mouths hungry and teeming with spittle and frothing blood. As the worms drew perilously close, Randall and I seemed to break from our paralysis, and with a speed that can only be appropriate to men faced with the very aspect of hell, we tore away, the hissing and spitting creatures teeming at our heels as we scrambled up the hill. I was able to reach the top without much difficulty, but Randall hesitated for just a split second as he reached it, and just like that, just as he'd nearly fallen off the edge of the road all those years ago, he put himself at risk. And this time, the malicious thing chasing us took him. A worm reared up and fastened itself on his leg and bit into him. He screamed with an agony that I hoped never to hear again, and tried to shake the thing off. I reached out and pulled him up, the thing with him, and was about to savagely kick at his own leg when the worm unfastened with an unnerving, hacking burble that I could almost have mistaken for a human laugh. Randall and I didn't pause to reflect on the significance. Instead, we fled those cursed woods, and we fled past the awful portal known as the preschool gate. We fled into the dull gray light of oncoming dawn. Needless to say, I took Randall to the hospital for his wounds. Then, as soon as he settled in, I went to the police and told them, in as near an approximation of the truth as I could, what had happened. I didn't expect them to exact retribution of any kind, but I did hope that they would once more regard that stretch of land as too dangerous and fence it off. So I told them that I and Randall had been attacked and even sat for a sketch artist. However, when the detective in charge of the case saw what I had told them to draw up, he called me into his office with a demeanor of intense and foreboding seriousness. "It's not possible that you saw this person," he told me. I bristled. "Why not?" I asked. "Because he's too important for you to believe a fag like me?" "No, sir," the detective said, sounding both hurt and irritated. "Because this man is dead. I know. I shot him myself in 1991. And that was when he told me the rest of the story about an incident I recollected only too well. The story of how two boys had told the police that they had seen some sort of monster attacking another boy in the woods. But this time there were details I didn't know. At the time of the boys' reports, the police had got wind of a vicious serial rapist who targeted the local gay community. However, due to the shame that still attended homosexuality and the mistrust of the authorities among that community, it was all they could do to establish that this person existed, let alone get a description of what he looked like or how he attacked his victims. The two boys, me and Randall, had given him their only break in even remotely figuring out how the incidents were happening and where. After our report, they went beyond the preschool gate, down to that stretch of frozen river where I'd seen what I thought was a monster attacking a young teenager. They found the monster, only he wasn't a monster. He was a druggie known for taking refuge at a local church, who had vanished ever since he contacted HIV from one of many victims. When they found him, the disease had spread all over his body, leaving weeping lesions on every inch of his skin, and leaving his mind in a state of near animal madness. As soon as he had seen them, the rapist had run at them, screaming that they were demon fags, and that he would fuck the demons out of them. The detective told me he'd shot the man point-blank in the head. The victim we'd seen him raping, who killed himself a few weeks later, and who had his picture put in the paper by grieving parents hoping to call attention to the AIDS crisis, was the last victim that vicious fiend in human form would ever hurt. Except he wasn't. Though the detective will never know that. Randall was the last victim of the preschool gate's hidden monster. I know that now that the hospital has told me what they found after testing his blood to see if what bit him was poisonous. You can likely guess what it was, and I assume I don't need to tell you that. Having my own blood and semen tested, I know it didn't come from me. Yet nevertheless it was there. And whether ghost or zombie or demon, the spirit of the rapist behind the preschool gate gave it to him. That cruel, insane, anonymous nobody who devoted first his body and now apparently his soul to spreading the HIV virus. And after years of lying in wait for the witnesses who had stopped him, the preschool gate's monster has had his revenge. Randall, poor, sweet, traumatized Randall, has only months to live before he dies of what the monster's bite poured into his blood. Randall's contacted HIV of a strain so potent that the doctors say they didn't think it was possible. But I'm not surprised. After all, it only makes sense that the malicious living pandemic that he cheated of its prey once has made sure he will never, ever escape again.